I was a chef sabotaged by my Sous until I revealed his food poisoning cover-up. But first, I had to watch Marcus throw me under the bus with that same charming smile he'd used for 3 years while systematically destroying everything I'd built. The conference room felt smaller than usual, packed with corporate suits from the restaurant group's headquarters. I sat across from them, still wearing my chef's whites from the lunch service, the fabric damp with sweat and the lingering aroma of the seared duck that had earned us a standing ovation just 2 hours earlier. Marcus stood behind me, his presence a cold weight against my shoulder blades. The regional manager, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses, spread photographs across the mahogany table. Health department citations, violation reports, temperature logs showing dangerous fluctuations in our walk-in coolers. My signature at the bottom of each damning document. My hands remained steady on the table's edge, but my mind raced. Those signatures looked authentic, the slight upward slant on my capital letters, the way I crossed my T's. But I hadn't signed a single one of these reports. The general manager leaned forward, her expression a mixture of disappointment and disgust. Her finger tapped against one particular photograph, a close-up of moldy vegetables in what appeared to be our prep area. The timestamp showed last Tuesday, 3:47 a.m. I'd been home with food poisoning that night, violently ill and barely able to stand. Marcus shifted behind me, and I caught his reflection in the window. His face wore the perfect mask of concerned professionalism, but I'd worked beside him long enough to recognize the subtle tells. The way he pressed his lips together when he was holding back satisfaction. The slight elevation of his left eyebrow when things were going exactly according to plan. The corporate lawyer slid a termination agreement across the table. The words blurred slightly as I scanned them. Gross negligence, violation of food safety protocols, immediate dismissal without severance. My 15 years in this kitchen, the reputation I'd built from nothing, the team I'd trained and mentored, all of it reduced to legal terminology and corporate liability protection. I signed the papers with the same steady hand that had earned 3 James Beard nominations. Marcus watched me do it, and when I stood to leave, he finally spoke. His words sounded rehearsed, practiced in front of a mirror until they carried just the right tone of regretful authority. The meaning was clear. He was sorry to see me go, but the safety of the guests had to come first. He hoped I'd find success elsewhere. The restaurant would miss my contributions. Each syllable felt like a knife between my ribs. I walked through my former kitchen, one last time. The afternoon prep crew looked up from their stations with confused expressions. Word traveled fast in restaurant kitchens, but not this fast. They'd know soon enough. Marcus would make sure of that, probably with the same tone of sorrowful necessity he'd just used on me. The walk to my car took place in a strange bubble of silence. The parking lot stretched endlessly, and each step felt like walking underwater. My keys felt foreign in my hand, and when I started the engine, the familiar rumble sounded muffled and distant. I drove home on autopilot, my mind cycling through the last few months. The subtle changes I'd noticed but dismissed. Marcus arriving early and staying late, always with a reasonable explanation. The way he'd started handling more of the administrative work, insisting he wanted to take some pressure off me. His sudden interest in our supplier relationships and inventory management. The temperature logs that had damned me were his responsibility. He'd volunteered for that job 6 months ago, claiming he wanted to understand every aspect of kitchen operations. I'd been proud of his initiative. My apartment felt like a tomb. I sat at my kitchen table, a small, scarred wooden surface that had witnessed the planning of countless menus, and stared at the termination papers. The corporate letterhead seemed to mock me with its pristine formatting in official language. Sleep came in fragments that night. I kept waking with the taste of betrayal in my mouth, more bitter than any burnt sauce or over-reduced wine. Each time I closed my eyes, I saw Marcus standing behind me in that conference room, his reflection wearing that subtle expression of victory. Morning brought no relief, only the harsh reality of professional destruction. I made coffee with hands that shook slightly, not from nerves, but from a deep, settling rage that had spent the night crystallizing into something harder and more focused. The food poisoning that had kept me home Tuesday night. The timing felt too convenient now, too perfectly aligned with the timestamp on those damning photographs. I tried to remember what I'd eaten that day when the symptoms had started. Marcus had brought me soup from the restaurant Monday evening, an unusual gesture that had touched me at the time. I opened my laptop and began researching food safety violations, health department procedures, the legal requirements for documentation. If Marcus had orchestrated my downfall this precisely, he'd left traces. People always left traces when they got too clever for their own good. The first clue came from an unlikely source. My former pastry chef, Elena, called that afternoon. Her voice carried the careful neutrality of someone who knew phones might be monitored, but her message was clear enough. She'd noticed some irregularities in recent weeks, temperature logs that didn't match her own observations, supplier deliveries that seemed off schedule, Marcus spending unusual amounts of time in the office after hours. More importantly, she'd seen him with his phone out near the prep stations late at night, apparently taking photographs. She'd assumed he was documenting procedures for training purposes, but now the implications seemed darker. I thanked her carefully, keeping my own voice neutral. But when I hung up, something predatory and patient had awakened in my chest. The next 2 weeks passed in careful reconnaissance. I parked across from the restaurant during different shifts, noting the patterns of delivery trucks, the schedules of cleaning crews, the times when Marcus arrived and departed. I cultivated casual contacts among the kitchen staff through social media, former colleagues who were curious about my sudden departure, but too professional to pry directly. The picture that emerged was methodical and brilliant in its malice. Marcus had been planning this for months, possibly longer. He'd gradually taken over key administrative functions, positioning himself as indispensable while setting up systems that could be manipulated. The temperature monitoring equipment had been subtly tampered with, not enough to cause actual food safety issues, but enough to create false readings that could be documented and reported. The health department violations were real documents, but they'd been fabricated after the fact. Marcus had staged photographs in sections of the kitchen during off hours, using props and careful lighting to simulate violations that had never occurred. My forged signatures were masterful. He'd probably spent weeks practicing them. But the food poisoning that had kept me away during his crucial evidence-gathering night wasn't random. Marcus had been patient, waiting for the perfect opportunity to sideline me while he created his damning documentation. The soup he'd brought me contained just enough of the wrong bacteria to guarantee I'd be violently ill for exactly the right amount of time. The elegance of it was almost admirable. If I hadn't been the target, I might have appreciated the thoroughness of his planning. Now I began my own planning phase. Marcus had used the system against me, but systems work both ways. I started by reconstructing the timeline of his sabotage, identifying every document, every photograph, every falsified record he'd created. Each piece of evidence he'd manufactured against me was also evidence of his own criminal activity: forgery, fraud, possibly attempted poisoning. The restaurant's computer system still recognized my login credentials. Marcus had been thorough about destroying my reputation, but he'd overlooked the mundane details of IT security. Late at night, from coffee shops with strong Wi-Fi signals, I accessed our internal systems and began documenting everything. The real temperature logs were stored in the system's backup files, showing that our coolers had maintained perfect temperatures throughout the period in question. Marcus had created a second set of falsified logs and somehow substituted them in the primary database. But he couldn't alter the automatic backups without administrative access he didn't possess. I found his staged photographs in the metadata of his personal work account. The timestamps, GPS coordinates, and camera settings told the complete story of his deception. He'd been careless with digital security, probably assuming that my termination would end any threat of discovery. More damaging still were his email communications with a contact at a competing restaurant group. The messages were carefully worded, but unmistakably clear. Marcus had been recruited to sabotage our operation from within. His payoff would be a head chef position at their flagship location, with a salary nearly double what I'd been earning. But the most valuable discovery came from the restaurant's security camera system. Marcus had disabled the cameras during his evidence staging sessions, but he'd failed to disable the system's automatic backup protocol. Every moment of his late-night theatrical productions had been recorded and uploaded to our cloud storage. I watched hours of footage showing Marcus carefully arranging props, photographing stage violations, and even practicing his expressions of concerned professionalism in the reflection of stainless steel surfaces. The narcissism was breathtaking. He'd actually rehearsed his performance for the termination meeting. The hardest part was waiting. Every instinct screamed for immediate action, for confrontation, for the satisfaction of watching his carefully constructed lie collapse around him. But revenge served cold was more than just a cliche. It was strategy. I spent another week organizing my evidence, creating a comprehensive dossier that told the complete story of Marcus's deception. Screenshots, video files, forensic analysis of the forged documents, the email trail showing his conspiracy with our competitors. Everything assembled into an unassailable narrative. But I also spent that week learning about Marcus's new position. The competing restaurant group had announced his hiring with considerable fanfare, promoting him as a rising star in the culinary world who would bring innovative leadership to their expansion plans. They'd even featured him in a local business journal interview, where he spoke eloquently about the importance of food safety and ethical kitchen management. The interview had been published with professional photographs showing Marcus in pristine chef's whites, his expression radiating competence and integrity. Reading his quoted words about the sacred trust between chef and diner made my jaw clench with such force that I tasted blood. His first day at the new restaurant was scheduled for a Monday. I planned my revelation for the Friday before. The health department received my anonymous tip at exactly 4:47 p.m. on Friday afternoon, late enough in the day that they'd have to act immediately, but early enough that the story would hit the weekend news cycle. I'd crafted the message carefully, providing just enough specific detail to ensure immediate investigation without revealing my own involvement. The local food safety inspector who responded was someone I'd worked with for years during routine inspections. She was thorough, professional, and utterly intolerant of the kind of violations Marcus had fabricated against me. More importantly, she understood digital evidence and would recognize the significance of metadata and timestamp analysis. I wasn't there when she arrived at Marcus's new restaurant with 2 colleagues and a police detective specializing in fraud cases. But I'd positioned myself in a coffee shop across the street with a clear view of the front entrance. Marcus emerged 20 minutes later in handcuffs. The sight should have provided immediate satisfaction, but instead I felt only a cold, measured pleasure. This was just the beginning. The story broke on the local news that evening. The reporter had clearly done her research, presenting a detailed account of the fraud scheme that had destroyed an award-winning chef's career while elevating his corrupt protege. They'd even obtained some of the security camera footage, showing Marcus staging his false evidence in the original restaurant's kitchen. But the real payoff came Monday morning, when the corporate lawyers from both restaurant groups held their damage control meetings. Marcus's new employers fired him before lunch, citing morals clause violations that would prevent him from collecting any portion of his signing bonus. They also announced their intention to pursue civil action for fraud and damage to their reputation. My former employers faced a different crisis. The evidence I'd provided to investigators clearly showed that Marcus had committed his crimes while employed by them, using their facilities and equipment. Their corporate insurance wouldn't cover the liability exposure, and their legal team was already fielding calls from employment attorneys representing other staff members who'd witnessed the fraudulent termination. The regional manager who'd presided over my firing called that afternoon. His voice carried the careful tone of someone who'd been thoroughly briefed by lawyers on exactly what he could and couldn't say. He wanted to discuss my potential return to the company, with full restoration of my previous position and appropriate compensation for the misunderstanding that had led to my departure. I let him finish his prepared speech before responding with the single word I'd been rehearsing for weeks. The silence that followed was everything I'd hoped for. I could practically hear his panic through the phone as he realized that their attempt at quiet damage control had just become infinitely more complicated. I'd already accepted a position with a respected restaurant group in another city, a head chef role with complete creative control, and a salary that reflected my actual market value. But more importantly, I'd retained legal counsel who specialized in employment fraud cases and who was very interested in the precedent my situation might establish. The lawsuit I filed the following week sought damages not just for lost wages and reputation, but for the emotional distress of professional sabotage and the criminal conspiracy that had enabled it. Marcus was named as a co-defendant, along with both restaurant groups and the individual managers who'd participated in my termination. The discovery phase would be particularly interesting. My attorneys had already identified several other cases where Marcus's previous employers had terminated senior staff under suspicious circumstances. The pattern suggested this wasn't his first attempt at climbing the career ladder through sabotage. But the most satisfying aspect of my revenge wasn't financial or legal. It was watching Marcus's reaction when he finally understood the scope of what I'd uncovered. The moment came during his deposition, 3 months after his arrest. I wasn't required to attend, but I'd arranged to be in the building on other business. The conference room where his legal team was attempting damage control had glass walls, and I'd positioned myself at a nearby table with clear sightlines. Marcus sat across from my attorney, His expensive suit unable to disguise the weight he'd lost, or the exhausted slump of his shoulders. The confident charm that had carried him through years of deception had evaporated, leaving behind something hollow and desperate. When my attorney presented the complete dossier of evidence, every forged document, every staged photograph, every incriminating email, Marcus's face went through a fascinating progression of expressions. First confusion, then recognition, then the dawning horror of someone who realized that his victim had been watching, learning, and planning from the very beginning. His eyes found mine through the glass wall at exactly the moment he understood that I'd known about his conspiracy for months before taking action. The look we shared lasted perhaps 3 seconds, but it contained everything I'd needed to communicate. I had been patient, I had been thorough, and I had won. Marcus pled guilty to fraud and conspiracy charges the following week. His sentencing included 18 months in minimum security prison, 5 years probation, and restitution payments that would follow him for decades. Both restaurant groups settled my lawsuit for amounts that allowed me to open my own place 5 years ahead of schedule. The local culinary community has a long memory for this kind of scandal. Marcus will never work in a professional kitchen again, at least not under his own name. His betrayal became a cautionary tale told in cooking schools and restaurant management courses, a reminder that talent without integrity is ultimately worthless. I opened my restaurant 8 months later, in a space with perfect natural light and a kitchen designed to my exact specifications. The name I chose reflected my new understanding of how business really worked. Reckoning. On opening night, as I watched my new team execute the menu we'd perfected through months of testing, I felt something I hadn't experienced since the day Marcus destroyed my previous life. Pure, uncomplicated satisfaction with my work and my place in the world. The revenge was complete, but the real victory was simpler than that. I'd reclaimed my identity as a chef, not just someone who prepared food, but someone who understood that cooking was fundamentally about trust. Trust between chef and diner, trust between colleagues, trust in the systems that make civilization possible. Marcus had broken that trust and paid the appropriate price. But more importantly, I'd learned that some betrayals can actually make you stronger, if you're patient enough to let them teach you what you're really capable of achieving. The last I heard, Marcus was working in a warehouse, loading trucks for a food distribution company. The irony probably isn't lost on him, handling the same ingredients he'd once manipulated in service of his grand deception, but now as just another anonymous laborer in the supply chain he'd tried to corrupt. Sometimes I wonder if he thinks about that conference room where he stood behind me, savoring what he thought was his moment of triumph. Whether he understands now that his real mistake wasn't underestimating my talent or my determination, but overestimating his own cleverness. The best revenge isn't just about making someone pay for what they've done. It's about showing them exactly who they thought they were destroying and proving that they never understood their target at all. I was a chef sabotaged by my Sous until I revealed his food poisoning cover-up. But I was always much more than he'd bargained for.